September 19, 1944. Eastern France. A young German tank commander stands in the cold morning air, fog rolling through the hedgerows like smoke from a funeral pyre. His name is Klaus Richter, 26 years old, Iron Cross pinned to his chest. 2 years on the Eastern Front behind him. Kursk, the nightmare at the Dnieper, battles that turned boys into ghosts. He'd survived all of it. But standing there that morning, scanning the mist through his binoculars, Richter feels something he hasn't felt since his first day in combat. Fear. Not of dying. Every tanker makes peace with that possibility the moment they climb through the hatch. No, this is different. This is the fear of fighting something you can't see, can't predict, can't kill. 3 weeks ago, near the town of Nancy, 12 German Panthers vanished in 17 minutes. Not destroyed by artillery, not caught in an ambush by infantry. Killed by something faster than physics should allow. Something that appeared like a shadow, fired with surgical precision, then evaporated before German guns could even rotate toward the threat. The survivors spoke in whispers, hushed voices in darkened command posts. They spoke of ghosts, American ghosts, tank destroyers that moved like nothing they'd ever faced. One gunner swore he landed a direct hit on an enemy vehicle, watched the round impact the hull, only to see the target accelerate away at speeds that defied every principle of armored combat he'd been taught. The intelligence officers laughed it off. Combat fatigue, shock, the mind playing tricks under fire. But then it happened again. Aracourt, Luneville, Chateau Salin. Every time German armor met American tank destroyers, the pattern repeated. Contact lasting 2 minutes, maybe 3 if the Germans were lucky. Then nothing but burning wrecks and the smell of diesel smoke. The Americans had a name for their machine. They called it the Hellcat, and it was rewriting every rule of armored warfare ever written. Because in war, speed isn't just an advantage. Sometimes it's the only thing keeping you alive. And sometimes it's the last thing your enemy ever sees. The fog thickens. Richter lights a cigarette with trembling hands. Somewhere out there, beyond the mist, the hunters are waiting. And this time, the Panthers are the prey. Klaus Richter had seen the intelligence report, held it in his hands 2 days earlier, reading the technical specifications with a mix of disbelief and dread. The American M18, designated a tank destroyer, built by Buick, of all companies. An automobile manufacturer tasked with creating a killing machine. And what they'd created seemed impossible. 17 tons, a third the weight of his Panther, 76mm gun, capable of punching through 4 inches of steel at 1,000 yards. Top speed 55 miles per hour. Richter read that last number 3 times. His Panther, when everything was working perfectly, when the roads weren't cratered and the mud wasn't pulling at the tracks, could manage 25. In reality, across the torn landscape of war-ravaged France, 15 was optimistic. The mathematics were brutal, simple, unforgiving. His crew needed 45 seconds to spot a target, calculate the range, account for wind and movement, and fire. Another 15 to reload. If an M18 appeared at effective combat range, roughly 1,000 meters, and his gunner performed flawlessly, they might get off 2 shots. 3, if they were blessed by whatever gods still watched over tank crews. But while they were acquiring that target, the Hellcat would already be moving. 90 seconds to cross that killing ground. 20 seconds for its hydraulic turret to spin a full 360 and lock onto a target. By the time the 3rd German round left the barrel, the American would be gone. Vanished. Like it was never there. 3 minutes. That's all the time German tank commanders had. 3 minutes before the ghost disappeared into the fog. The story didn't begin on the battlefields of France. It began in the frantic, desperate corridors of American military planning in 1941. The world was burning. Poland had fallen in weeks. France collapsed in 40 days. The German blitzkrieg rolled east like an iron avalanche, crushing everything in its path. And America, still reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor, knew it was next. Major General Andrew Bruce stood in front of a map at Camp Hood, Texas, watching red arrows sweep across Europe. He was the newly appointed commander of the Tank Destroyer Center, a position that didn't exist 6 months earlier, created out of panic and necessity. Bruce studied those red arrows, German tank columns breaking through defensive lines, exploiting gaps, encircling entire armies before they even knew they were surrounded. Everyone else saw unstoppable force. Bruce saw a different problem. The answer to mass tank attacks, he realized, wasn't more tanks. Wasn't thicker armor or bigger guns. It was speed, firepower, and the ability to be where the enemy didn't expect you. His philosophy was radical, borderline heretical to traditional military thinking. While the British built heavier tanks and the Soviets added more steel, Bruce wanted something that could race to a breakthrough point and destroy an armored column before it could exploit the gap. Think of it like naval warfare, he told his skeptical staff. You don't fight battleships with more battleships. You send destroyers, fast, maneuverable, hit hard and get out. Hence the name, Tank Destroyer. The development contract went to Buick, the car company. Engineers who built vehicles for families driving to church on Sunday, now tasked with building a machine to kill German Panthers. The project's chief engineer was a man named J. Edward Campbell, former racing car designer, a man who understood speed, not as a luxury, but as survival. Where traditional tank designers started with armor and added mobility as an afterthought, Campbell did the opposite. He started with the chassis of a light tank, stripped everything that wasn't essential, then asked his team one revolutionary question. How fast can we make this thing go? The answer rolled out of the Detroit arsenal in July 1943. The T-70 prototype. It weighed 17 tons when every other combat vehicle was adding weight. It mounted an engine designed for aircraft, not tanks. 400 horsepower pushing what was essentially a gun on tracks. When test drivers first opened the throttle at Aberdeen Proving Ground, observers thought the speedometers were broken. 55 miles per hour. For a tracked combat vehicle, it was unheard of. Campbell's racing background showed everywhere. He borrowed suspension innovations from Indianapolis race cars, used torsion bars that could handle punishment at speeds that would shake other vehicles apart. Engineers worried it couldn't be done, that the vehicle would tear itself to pieces. Campbell proved them wrong. By January 1944, the assembly line at Buick's Flint, Michigan facility was churning out production models. The same factory that made family sedans now produced killing machines. They called it the M18. But the crews who would drive it into combat had a different name, Hellcat, because that's what it felt like. A predator. Sleek. Fast. Merciless. By June 6, 1944, when Allied forces stormed the beaches at Normandy, the first Hellcat battalions were already in England. More than 2,400 would eventually roll into Europe, organized into independent battalions that operated with unusual freedom for the rigidly hierarchical American Army. The crews selected for Hellcat duty underwent specialized training that emphasized one thing above all else: aggression. Not the mindless charge-forward kind. The calculated, predatory kind. Find the enemy. Hit them where it hurts. Disappear before they can hit back. The official motto of the Tank Destroyer Force was 3 words: seek, strike, destroy. It wasn't propaganda. It was a promise. August 12, 1944. Lieutenant Marcus Webb sat in the commander's position of his Hellcat, watching a column of German armor move through the French countryside near Argentan. He was 23 years old, from Ohio, college kid who enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor. He'd been in combat for 2 months, long enough to understand that survival wasn't about luck. It was about being faster, smarter, more ruthless than the enemy. His platoon, 5 Hellcats operating as an independent unit, had intercepted 8 German Panzer IVs trying to reinforce a defensive line. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. Webb's after-action report, preserved in the National Archives, reads like a chess match played at 50 miles per hour. His Hellcats raced to firing positions on the flanks of the German column, fired 3-4 rounds, then accelerated away before the Panthers could bring their heavier guns to bear. When German tanks tried to wheel around to face the threat, other Hellcats appeared from different angles, attacking, disappearing, reappearing. A three-dimensional nightmare. All 8 German tanks destroyed. Webb's battalion suffered 1 Hellcat disabled, not by enemy fire, but by a thrown track on rough terrain. 2 crew members wounded by shell fragments. That was it. The kill ratio spoke for itself, but numbers don't capture what it felt like to be inside those German tanks. To hear the crack of a gun, feel the impact, watch your commander's tank erupt in flames, and never even see who killed you. October 1944. Cold morning outside the French town of Bruyères. Sergeant Thomas Morrison climbs into his Hellcat, running through the pre-combat ritual that separates professionals from corpses. He's from Georgia, former stock car mechanic. The kind of guy who understood machines the way some men understand women. Intuitively, instinctively. The Hellcat demanded different skills than conventional tanks. Different instincts. Morrison had exactly the right blend of mechanical intuition and aggressive confidence. The crew compartment was cramped, open-topped, protected by armor that wouldn't stop anything bigger than rifle rounds. That open turret seemed like a death sentence. But Morrison understood the design philosophy. If enemy shells are hitting you, you've already made a fatal mistake. The Hellcat's survival depended on being somewhere else when return fire arrived. That open turret, which seemed like vulnerability, actually provided crucial advantages. It reduced weight. 3 tons saved right there. It improved situational awareness. You could hear approaching armor before you saw it. In the forests and villages of Europe, that could mean the difference between ambusher and victim. It allowed faster ammunition handling. No cramped space, no fumbling with hatches. Morrison's crew consisted of 5 men, each cross-trained on multiple positions. The driver, Corporal James Kowalski, could coax the Continental engine through terrain that would swallow heavier vehicles whole. He claimed he could feel the ground speaking to him through the suspension, where the solid earth was, where the mud would trap you. The assistant driver, Private Danny Chen, operated the bow machine gun, but spent most engagements scanning for threats and plotting escape routes. His job was thinking 3 moves ahead. In the turret, the gunner and loader worked in synchronized rhythm that determined whether the crew lived or died. Corporal Marcus Washington, the gunner, had attended artillery school before volunteering for tank destroyers. He understood ballistics the way Morrison understood engines. Range, wind, target movement, all calculated in the seconds available. His partner, Private First Class Antonio Rodriguez, could load the 76mm gun in under 10 seconds, even when the vehicle was racing across broken ground at 30 miles per hour. The 76mm M18 gun represented American industrial innovation at its finest. According to technical specifications, it fired armor-piercing rounds at 2,800 feet per second. At 1,000 yards, roughly 900 meters, it could penetrate 4 inches of vertical armor plate. That was sufficient to defeat the frontal armor of German Panzer foes, the side armor of Panthers and Tigers. But the real innovation wasn't the gun. It was the hydraulic turret traverse system, borrowed from naval gun mounts, allowed the crew to rotate the entire turret 360 degrees in 20 seconds. Compare that to over a minute for hand-cranked systems in earlier tank destroyers. But the real innovation was how Hellcat crews employed the weapon system. Traditional tank doctrine emphasized frontal engagements. Armor thickness and gun penetration determined victory. Hellcat doctrine rejected that entirely. Morrison and his fellow commanders were trained to use speed and maneuver to achieve flank or rear shots, where even the heaviest German armor was vulnerable. The Hellcat wasn't designed to slug it out toe-to-toe with Panthers. It was designed to appear on their flanks, kill them, vanish before their companions could respond. The tactical doctrine followed a consistent pattern. Reconnaissance elements locate enemy armor. Hellcat platoons, typically 5 vehicles operating together, use speed to race ahead of the enemy advance, circle behind enemy positions, establish ambush positions with carefully planned withdrawal routes. When German armor appears, the Hellcats engage from flank or rear, 800 to 1,200 meters. Close enough for guaranteed penetration, far enough for escape time. The critical moment comes after firing. While German crews are still identifying the threat direction, Hellcat drivers are already accelerating away, using terrain features, pre-planned routes, breaking visual contact. By the time German tanks rotate their turrets and prepare return fire, the Hellcat is 300 meters away and accelerating. 60 seconds later, it's behind the next hill or tree line, repositioning for another attack from a different angle. Morrison had refined this ballet of violence through 15 separate engagements. His crew operated with pit crew precision. They'd proven that speed wasn't just about the engine, it was about how fast you could identify targets, fire accurately, execute tactical withdrawal. His personal record was 7 seconds from target acquisition to first round fired. In Hellcat doctrine, that was an eternity. Some crews were achieving 5-second engagement times. October 1944. A basement in a requisitioned farmhouse near Metz. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber sits hunched over after-action reports, watching a pattern emerge that defies every principle of armored warfare he'd learned. Weber is the intelligence officer for the 11th Panzer Division. His job is finding patterns in combat data, developing countermeasures. The pattern emerging from these reports is nightmare fuel. September 1944 alone, German Panzer forces in France lost over 300 tanks across all types. American M18. Hellcat battalions, numbering fewer than 200 vehicles in the sector, were credited with approximately 130 confirmed kills. The kill-to-loss ratio was approaching 8-to-1 in the Hellcats' favor. For an army that built its reputation on armored superiority, these figures represented something more disturbing than tactical defeats. They suggested fundamental assumptions about armored warfare were being invalidated by American innovation. Weber's analysis identified the core problem. German Panzer doctrine evolved on the Eastern Front, where engagements occurred at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters across open-steppe terrain. At those distances, armor thickness and gun penetration dominated the equation. The Panther's 75mm gun could penetrate Soviet T-34 armor at 2,000 meters. The Tiger's 88mm gun was lethal at ranges approaching 3,000 meters. These vehicles were designed to fight and win engagements where they could be seen from a kilometer away. But the terrain of Western Europe changed everything. The hedgerow country of Normandy, the forests of the Vosges, the narrow urban streets of countless French and German towns, all reduced engagement ranges to 300 meters or less. At these distances, the Hellcat's lighter armor became irrelevant, while its speed and maneuverability became overwhelming advantages. A Panther that needed 45 seconds to acquire and engage a target simply couldn't compete with a Hellcat that could fire accurately in 7 seconds and be gone in 30. The mathematics were brutally simple. In a typical engagement scenario analyzed by Weber, a Hellcat platoon establishes an ambush position along an expected German approach route. When German tanks appear, the first indication of enemy presence is armor-piercing rounds already impacting their vehicles. German tank commanders need approximately 15 seconds to identify the threat direction, communicate with their crew, prepare to return fire. The Panther's turret rotation speed, 15 degrees per second with the hand-crank traverse system, means another 6 to 8 seconds to bring the gun on target. During those 23 seconds, the Hellcat fires twice, potentially 3 times if the loader is exceptionally fast. Then, before German gunners can even get a ranging shot off, the American vehicle is accelerating away. At maximum acceleration, the Hellcat achieves 30 miles per hour in approximately 12 seconds. By the time German tank commanders coordinate their response, identify aiming points, and fire their first shot. The Hellcat is 200 meters from its firing position, partially concealed by terrain or vegetation. The German response time from first contact to effective return fire averaged between 120 and 180 seconds. 2 to 3 minutes. The Hellcat's exposure time in the kill zone was typically 35 to 50 seconds. The window of vulnerability where German forces could achieve effective return fire was essentially non-existent. Weber proposed several countermeasures in his reports. Wider spacing between vehicles to prevent multiple kills in a single ambush. Pre-positioned security elements to scout routes before main forces committed. Coordination with infantry to flush out suspected ambush positions. More aggressive use of indirect fire. Mortars and artillery to saturate suspected Hellcat positions. Every countermeasure had been tried. None were particularly effective. October 24, 1944. Freezing rain in the Vosges Mountains. Lieutenant Marquis Webb's platoon of Hellcats from the 704 Tank Destroyer Battalion had dug in along a ridgeline overlooking the approach to Saint-Dié. The weather was miserable. Visibility poor. Perfect hunting conditions. German armor trying to navigate the mountain passes would be channeled into predictable routes. Their usual advantages in armor and gun range negated by terrain and weather. Webb positioned his 5 Hellcats in carefully prepared positions that exploited every feature of the ridgeline. Each vehicle had a primary firing position with clear sight lines to the valley road below, plus 2 alternate positions connected by routes his drivers had memorized in darkness. The positions were far enough apart that German artillery couldn't suppress multiple vehicles simultaneously, but close enough for the platoon to concentrate fire on any target. Escape routes led over the ridgeline's reverse slope, where the Hellcats could break contact and reposition before German observers could coordinate effective counterfire. Radio intercepts suggested a German armored column would attempt to reinforce positions further north. Division intelligence estimated a company-sized force, probably 12 to 15 tanks, likely a mix of Panthers and Panzer IVs. Webb's platoon wouldn't engage the entire column. They'd wait for the lead elements to enter the valley, destroy the first 2 or 3 vehicles to block the road, then focus on the rear of the column to prevent withdrawal. The Germans would be trapped in the valley, unable to advance or retreat, while Webb's Hellcats systematically destroyed them from positions the enemy couldn't effectively engage. The German column appeared at 0740 hours. Right on schedule, Webb counted 17 vehicles, 4 Panthers in the lead, followed by a mixed formation of Panzer IVs, and what looked like a couple of Jagdpanzer IVs bringing up the rear. They were moving cautiously, which was smart. But caution didn't help much when you were channeled into a valley with poor maneuver room and enemies on the high ground. Webb waited until the lead Panther was directly below his position, perhaps 600 meters away. At that range, the Hellcat's 76mm gun would slice through the Panther's top armor like paper. He gave the fire command. Corporal Washington sent the first round downrange. The armor-piercing shot hit the Panther's engine deck. The tank ground to a halt, smoke pouring from its vents. Before the German crew could evacuate, the second Hellcat in Webb's platoon fired, hitting the same vehicle in the rear hull. The Panther erupted in flames. The other Hellcats opened fire in coordinated sequence they'd practiced. The fourth vehicle in the German column, a Panzer IV, took a hit that penetrated its turret ring. The turret jammed. The last vehicle, one of the Jagdpanzers, was struck in the engine compartment and began burning. The German column was now trapped, unable to advance past the burning Panther or retreat past the destroyed Jagdpanzer. What followed was a masterclass in tank destroyer employment. For the next 42 minutes, according to Webb's after-action report, his platoon systematically engaged the trapped German vehicles. The Hellcats would fire from one position, then immediately displace to an alternate position before German return fire arrived. The Germans attempted to organize coordinated responses, but the combination of poor visibility, confusing terrain, and the Hellcat's mobility made it impossible to achieve effective fire control. German tank commanders couldn't maintain visual contact with the American vehicles long enough to coordinate responses. By the time a Panther identified a Hellcat's firing position and rotated its turret to engage, the American vehicle was already gone, reappearing seconds later from a completely different angle. The psychological effect was devastating. German crews were fighting an enemy they couldn't pin down, couldn't predict, couldn't escape from. Oberst Gustav Hoffmann had commanded panzer units since the invasion of Poland in 1939, survived 3 winters on the Eastern Front, earned the German Cross in Gold for his leadership during the retreat from Kursk. He'd faced Soviet armor in situations where tactical errors meant immediate death, developed instincts for armored combat that kept him alive through 5 years of war. The American Hellcat forced him to question everything he thought he understood about armored warfare. His battalion encountered Hellcats for the first time near Lunéville on September 18, 1944. The engagement lasted 19 minutes, cost Hoffmann 7 Panthers, nearly half his effective strength, in exchange for 1 American vehicle disabled by a lucky shot that damaged its transmission. The after-action analysis revealed what should have been obvious. His Panthers were magnificent vehicles designed for the wrong war. Or rather, the Americans had invented a new kind of war where traditional Panzer advantages became liabilities. The Eastern Front taught Hoffmann that armor engagements were about 4 factors: gun penetration, armor protection, crew training, numerical superiority. German tanks typically held advantages in the first 2 categories, Soviet forces in the 4th, and the 3rd determined which side could exploit their advantages most effectively. This calculus held true across thousands of engagements from Smolensk to Kharkov to Kursk. The Hellcat introduced a 5th factor that invalidated the traditional equation: speed as both offensive weapon and defensive protection. Hoffmann studied American tank destroyer doctrine through captured training manuals and debriefings of prisoners from Hellcat units. The American approach rejected every fundamental principle of German Panzer doctrine, where German tanks advanced in formation, supporting each other with overlapping fields of fire. Hellcats operated in dispersed patterns where individual vehicles acted semi-independently. Where German doctrine emphasized holding ground and fighting from defensive positions, American tank destroyers treated every position as temporary, never remaining static long enough for enemy forces to coordinate effective responses. The most disturbing aspect was how American doctrine leveraged their vehicle speed to achieve consistent first-shot advantages. In Hoffmann's experience, armored engagements were typically decided by whoever spotted the enemy first and got off the first accurate shot. German optics and crew training traditionally provided advantages in target acquisition, but that mattered little when Hellcats were already in position, waiting in ambush before German forces even entered the engagement area. Hoffmann began implementing countermeasures based on his analysis. He reorganized his battalion to operate in smaller, more dispersed formations that were harder for Hellcats to ambush effectively. He emphasized aggressive reconnaissance, using infantry and lighter vehicles to scout routes before committing his precious Panthers. Most importantly, he trained his crews to prioritize speed of engagement over precision. Better to get rounds downrange quickly, even if they weren't perfectly aimed, than to take time for ideal firing solutions that would never arrive because the target had already vanished. The new tactics achieved some success. In an engagement near Château Salins on October 9, 1944, Hoffmann's battalion encountered a platoon of Hellcats attempting to establish ambush positions. His lead element spotted the Americans moving into position, a rare occurrence, and immediately opened fire, forcing the Hellcats to break off their attack before they could achieve their preferred tactical setup. 1 Hellcat destroyed, another damaged. The remainder withdrew. It was the first time Hoffmann's battalion achieved better than even exchange rates against the American tank destroyers. December 1944 brought the coldest winter in decades to the Ardennes forest, and with it came Hitler's desperate gamble, the massive counteroffensive the Allies would call the Battle of the Bulge. for Hellcat battalions scattered across American lines. The German attack presented challenges unlike anything they'd encountered during the pursuit across France. The Americans were on the defensive. German forces had numerical superiority, and the frozen terrain limited the mobility advantages that made the Hellcat so deadly. The 634th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with M18 Hellcats, found itself rushed to the town of Saint-Vith on December 17, 1944, to help contain the German penetration. Captain James Thornton, the battalion's operations officer, watched from a hilltop observation post as elements of the 6th Panzer Army rolled west, the largest concentration of German armor he'd seen since Normandy. The numbers were daunting. Intelligence estimated over 200 German tanks in the assault waves heading toward American positions. The tactical situation was unprecedented for Hellcat operations. Instead of hunting German armor across the open countryside of France, the tank destroyers would fight a defensive battle from prepared positions. Instead of hit-and-run ambushes, they'd need to hold critical road junctions against overwhelming forces. The weather grounded Allied air support, eliminating one of America's key advantages. Frozen ground made digging in difficult. Heavy snowfall reduced the visibility that Hellcats' open turrets usually exploited. Thornton positioned his Hellcats to defend the critical road network converging on Saint-Vith. Each platoon received specific sectors to cover with firing positions selected to maximize the M18's advantages in gun performance while minimizing exposure to German return fire. The plan called for trading space for time, allowed German forces to advance into prepared kill zones, inflict maximum casualties, then withdraw to secondary positions before German forces could concentrate enough combat power to overwhelm the thinly held American lines. The German attack hit Thornton's positions on December 18th at dawn. The assault waves included Panthers and Panzerfus from elite Waffen-SS units, supported by infantry and assault guns. The Germans advanced with methodical precision of veteran units, executing a well-planned operation. But as they entered the approaches to Saint-Vith, they encountered the same nightmare that had haunted German panzer commanders since Normandy. Hellcats appearing from unexpected positions, firing with deadly accuracy, then vanishing before effective responses could be coordinated. Staff Sergeant Raymond Cooper commanded one of Thornton's Hellcats, positioned at a crucial crossroads south of Saint-Vith. His position overlooked a valley that German forces would need to traverse to reach the town. Cooper's crew had arrived the previous night, dug in their Hellcat, used the frozen ground to create a hull-down position that exposed only the turret. They'd prepared two alternate firing positions connected by routes they'd marked with white tape visible in the snow. The German column appeared at 0630. A company of Panthers advancing in formation with infantry support. Cooper let them close to 800 meters, well within the 76mm gun's effective range. Before opening fire, his first shot struck the lead Panther in the glacis plate. The armor-piercing round punched through and detonated the ammunition storage. The tank exploded spectacularly, blocking the road, forcing the following vehicles to stop. Cooper's loader, Private First Class Antonio Rodriguez, had already slammed the next round into the breach. The second shot hit the Panther behind the leader, penetrating the turret, killing the crew. Before the Germans could locate Cooper's position, his driver had the Hellcat moving, racing along the pre-planned route to the second firing position. 200 meters away, the entire engagement, 2 shots, 2 kills, displacement to alternate position, took 38 seconds. This pattern repeated throughout the day. Hellcats would engage from prepared positions, inflict casualties, then withdraw before German forces could concentrate effective return fire. The M18's speed remained an advantage even in defensive operations, where towed anti-tank guns and slower tank destroyers could be identified and destroyed once German forces pinpointed their positions. Hellcats could shoot and scoot, appearing at new locations before German artillery could adjust fire. Lieutenant Karl Schmidt joined the 9th SS Panzer Division in November 1944. a replacement officer fresh from training school who'd never experienced combat. His battalion commander, a decorated veteran of 4 years fighting, gave Schmidt advice that seemed to contradict everything he'd learned in training. When you encounter American tank destroyers, your survival depends on understanding that every tactical principle you've learned is designed to get you killed. The Americans don't fight the way we taught you to fight. Adapt or die. Schmidt's first engagement with Hellcats came on January 7, 1945, during the German withdrawal from the Ardennes. His platoon of 4 Panthers was providing rearguard security for withdrawing infantry when they received reports of American armor advancing along their withdrawal route. Schmidt deployed his tanks in a textbook defensive position, overlapping fields of fire, good sight lines, protected flanks, exactly as prescribed in the training manuals. The Hellcats appeared from 3 different directions simultaneously, a coordinated ambush that turned Schmidt's carefully prepared position into a death trap. The first indication of enemy presence was an armor-piercing round that penetrated his wingman's Panther through the rear deck armor, striking the engine, setting the tank ablaze. Before Schmidt could issue fire commands, a second Panther was hit from a different angle. This one struck in the turret ring. The third Panther began rotating its turret toward one of the enemy positions, but the Hellcat had already moved, appearing seconds later from behind a farmhouse 400 meters to the left. Schmidt's own tank was the 4th Panther in the formation. His driver reacted with the quick thinking that saved their lives. Without waiting for orders, the driver threw the transmission into reverse and backed the 45-ton Panther behind a stone barn at full speed. An armor-piercing round struck the ground where they'd been positioned a second earlier. The driver continued reversing, putting the barn between the Panther and the last known enemy position, then spun the tank around and accelerated away from the killing ground. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. 3 Panthers destroyed, 1 escaped, and Schmidt never got off a single shot. He never even got a clear look at the enemy vehicles that devastated his platoon. In his after-action report, preserved in German military archives captured after the war, Schmidt wrote something that captured the essence of Hellcat tactics better than any technical analysis. The American tank destroyers do not engage in combat. They execute. There is no battle. Only killing. That description captured something essential about Hellcat tactics that traditional military terminology struggled to express. Conventional armored engagements involved mutual combat, both sides maneuvering, shooting, attempting to achieve tactical advantage. Hellcat operations eliminated the mutual aspect. The Americans imposed their will through speed and positioning, creating situations where German forces couldn't meaningfully respond. It wasn't combat, it was systematic destruction. By early 1945, the Wehrmacht had developed more effective countermeasures against Hellcat tactics. Captured German training bulletins from this period show the recommendations: dispersed formations, aggressive reconnaissance, preemptive artillery fire on suspected ambush positions, and immediate withdrawal when contact was made, rather than attempting to fight. Essentially, German doctrine acknowledged that Panthers couldn't defeat Hellcats in direct engagement, and recommended avoiding contact whenever possible. This represented a remarkable psychological shift for an army that built its reputation on aggressive armored tactics. The Blitzkrieg doctrine that devastated Poland, France, and initially the Soviet Union emphasized concentrated armor attacking at points of enemy weakness, achieving breakthrough and exploitation. Now, German forces were being taught to avoid combat with a specific enemy vehicle type, to treat contact with Hellcats as a reason to withdraw rather than engage. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, but the Hellcats' impact on armored warfare extended far beyond the destruction tallied in after-action reports. The M18 validated a radical concept: that mobility and firepower could substitute for armor protection in specific tactical applications. According to official U.S. Army statistics compiled after the war, M18 Hellcat battalions achieved the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any American armored vehicle in the European theater, approximately 4-1 overall, with some battalions exceeding 8-1. The 704 Tank Destroyer Battalion, one of the highest-scoring Hellcat units, was credited with destroying over 600 German armored vehicles during 11 months of combat operations. From Normandy to Germany, the battalion lost 53 Hellcats during the same period, approximately 40 to enemy action, the remainder to mechanical failure or accidents. This represented a paradigm shift in armored combat, where survival came not from withstanding enemy fire, but from avoiding it entirely through superior mobility. The German perspective, documented in post-war interviews with surviving Panzer commanders, revealed the psychological impact of facing Hellcats. Oberst Hoffmann, who survived the war, described the experience in his memoir published in 1953. The M18 was not simply a weapon system. It represented a fundamentally different philosophy of armored warfare that our doctrine couldn't counter effectively. We were taught to win through superiority in armor, firepower, and crew training. The Americans demonstrated that speed and tactical flexibility could trump all three. The M18's open-topped turret, initially considered a vulnerability by conventional military thinking, proved to be an advantage in actual combat operations. The design saved 3 tons of weight that would have been consumed by a fully enclosed turret, allowing for higher speeds and better acceleration. The improved situational awareness from the open turret helped crews detect threats earlier and coordinate responses faster. In the terrain of Western Europe, where engagement ranges were typically under 800 meters, the thin armor became irrelevant. Any German tank gun that achieved a hit would penetrate regardless of armor thickness. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Army's Armored Board identified the key factors in the Hellcat's success. First, the power-to-weight ratio that enabled exceptional mobility. Second, the hydraulic turret traverse that allowed rapid engagement of targets from any direction. Third, the 76mm gun that could defeat German armor at typical engagement ranges. Fourth, and perhaps most important, the tactical doctrine that leveraged these technical advantages into consistent operational success. The Hellcat's influence shaped post-war armored vehicle development worldwide. The concept of light, fast, powerfully armed vehicles optimized for specific tactical roles rather than general-purpose employment became standard in military planning. The French AMX-13, the Soviet ASU-85, and later the American M551 Sheridan, all reflected lessons learned from the M18's operational success. The emphasis on mobility as protection, the importance of power-to-weight ratios, and the value of specialized vehicles for specific tactical missions, all traced back to the Hellcat's combat record. For the German tank crews who faced them in 1944 and 45, the M18 Hellcat represented more than just an effective weapon system. It symbolized the moment when American industrial capacity and innovative thinking combined to create solutions that German military tradition couldn't counter. The 3 minutes that German crews had to engage Hellcats before they vanished at 55 miles per hour became emblematic of a larger truth. In modern warfare, speed and adaptability could defeat armor and firepower when employed with the right tactics. The last combat employment of M18 Hellcats in American service occurred during the Korean War, where several battalions were deployed in 1950 to counter North Korean armor. The mountainous terrain of Korea presented different challenges than the European theater, but the Hellcat's mobility again proved decisive. In the opening months of the war, M18 units achieved remarkable success against Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks. The 773 Tank Destroyer Battalion was credited with destroying over 50 enemy tanks during the defense of the Pusan perimeter. Staff Sergeant Thomas Morrison, who had commanded a Hellcat in Europe and volunteered for service in Korea, found himself back in an M18 turret near the Naktong River in August 1950. The tactical situation was reversed from his European experience. Now, American forces were defending against numerically superior armor attacks, but the fundamental principles remained unchanged. Morrison's crew would wait in prepared positions, allow North Korean T-34s to advance into killing zones, engage from the flank or rear, then displace before enemy forces could coordinate responses. The engagement patterns Morrison experienced in Korea validated lessons from Europe. Speed remained the Hellcat's primary protection. The ability to rapidly shift positions kept enemy forces off balance and prevented them from concentrating overwhelming firepower against individual vehicles. The 76mm gun, which had proven effective against German Panthers, easily defeated the T-34's armor at typical engagement ranges. The open turret, criticized by some military planners as obsolete, continued to provide tactical advantages in situational awareness and crew coordination. However, the Korean War also revealed the Hellcat's limitations in the evolving landscape of armored warfare. By 1950, the M18 was already obsolete compared to newer armored vehicles entering service. The arrival of Soviet-supplied heavy tanks later in the war, including the IS-2 and IS-3, presented challenges that the Hellcat's gun couldn't consistently overcome. The 76mm weapon that had been adequate against World War II German armor struggled against the heavier frontal protection of post-war Soviet designs. The last American M18 battalion was deactivated in 1953, shortly after the Korean War armistice. The tank destroyer concept itself fell out of favor in American military doctrine. Post-war analysis concluded that specialized tank destroyer units were redundant in an era when main battle tanks could perform anti-armor missions while also providing general-purpose combat capability. The M18 was replaced by vehicles like the M48 Patton, which combined armor protection, firepower, and mobility in a single platform optimized for multiple tactical roles. Yet the Hellcat's influence persisted in unexpected ways. Several nations acquired surplus M18s after the war, with some remaining in service into the 1970s and even 80s. The Yugoslav People's Army operated Hellcats until 1972, valuing their mobility in mountainous terrain. The Chinese nationalist forces on Taiwan employed M18s into the 1960s, seeing them as cost-effective solutions for coastal defense. Venezuela maintained a small fleet of Hellcats until 1975, using them primarily for training rather than combat operations. The veterans who had crewed Hellcats during World War II carried memories of a vehicle that represented something unique in military history, a weapon system so perfectly matched to its tactical doctrine that it achieved success far beyond what its specifications suggested possible. At reunions of tank destroyer battalions held throughout the late 20th century, former crew members shared stories that emphasized not the vehicle's technical features, but the confidence it inspired. The knowledge that you could outrun anything you couldn't outfight created a psychological advantage that was as important as the gun or engine. Technical historians studying the M18 identified specific innovations that influenced subsequent armored vehicle development. The use of lightweight, high-strength steel alloys in the hull construction anticipated material science advances that became standard in post-war tank design. The hydraulic turret traverse system adapted from naval applications demonstrated the value of borrowing innovations from other military domains. The emphasis on automotive engineering principles in military vehicle design. Campbell's racing car background influencing the Hellcat's development suggested that civilian expertise could solve military problems in ways that traditional military thinking might miss. The story of German tank crews having 3 minutes to engage Hellcats before they vanished at 55 miles per hour became part of armored warfare legend. Cited in military academies worldwide as an example of how tactical innovation could overcome apparent disadvantages in armor and firepower. The M18 proved that warfare wasn't simply about building bigger guns and thicker armor. Sometimes victory came from being somewhere else when the enemy shot arrived, from choosing engagements on your terms, from speed and cunning rather than brute force. In the quiet corners of military museums across America, restored M18 Hellcats sit as monuments to a brief moment when innovation, doctrine, and execution aligned perfectly. The vehicles look deceptively small compared to modern main battle tanks, their open turrets seemingly vulnerable, their thin armor apparently inadequate. But the veterans who crewed them knew differently. They understood that the Hellcat wasn't designed to absorb punishment. It was designed to never be where the punishment landed, in that specific tactical niche. For that particular moment in military history, it was as close to perfect as any weapon system ever achieved. The legacy lives on in the fundamental principles that guided Hellcat employment. Know your advantages, exploit enemy weaknesses, dictate the terms of engagement, and survive to fight again. These weren't just tactical guidelines for operating a specific vehicle. They were timeless principles of warfare that the M18 Hellcat demonstrated with deadly effectiveness across the battlefields of two wars. For the German tank crews who faced them, those 3 minutes before the Hellcat vanished at 55 miles per hour must have felt like eternity. And for many, it was the last eternity they would ever experience. The fog never really lifted that September morning in France. Klaus Richter stood in his commander's cupola, scanning the hedgerows one last time. Somewhere out there, beyond the mist, the ghosts were waiting. Fast as lightning, silent as death. He took one final drag from his cigarette and wondered if he'd hear the shot that killed him. Or if, like so many others, he'd simply cease to exist, between one heartbeat and the next, before his finger even reached the trigger. The distant rumble of engines fades into silence. The wind carries the smell of diesel smoke across empty fields, and history remembers the machine that moved too fast to die. The Hellcat. 55 miles per hour, 3 minutes, and then nothing but ghosts and burning steel.